Marianne, you're back.
Hello.
Yes.
What an interesting, wonderful, wonderful day. This has just been amazing. Thank you, everybody out there who has shared their research and work. It's been amazing.
It's been
amazing. And art as well.
And art, yeah. It's been quite a, as I mentioned earlier, it's like trying to take a drink out of a fire hose. It's exciting. Well, I'm very excited for your talk, Marianne. And it's I think it's great compliment to Martini's earlier talk as well, with some of the modeling work that he did using the fisheries data. And
oh, absolutely, yes, yeah. And I hope I can do it justice, because I can start to feel I was up at 3:30 this morning. So if I I hope I'll hang in there.
I think we're all getting a little bit punch drunk right now. It's been a long day.
I need that happy hour to come around.
Yes. But so without further ado, we'll turn it over to you, and we look forward to hearing about. Oh, and please, Marianne, introduce yourself again. Because
yeah, so yeah, Marianne Nyegaard, and I co-authored the chapter on sunfishes together with my wonderful co-authors, and I'll just share my screen. So bear with me. So now I hope you guys can see the screen. So yeah, so I co-authored this chapter together with Salvador Garcia Barcelona from Spain. I hope I say your name correctly, Salva, and Natasha Phillips from Northern Ireland, and Itsuru Sawai from Japan. And my background is I did a PhD on ocean sunfishes and just fell in love, but also got sidetracked down a taxonomic rabbit hole. And so that has taken up a lot of my interest, is the, I guess, species aspect of a lot of the research that we do, is getting that to species level. So this chapter that we wrote was very much an exercise in scratching out little bits of information from here and there, because the chapter really is about fisheries and fisheries interactions with the Molidae family, to perhaps revisit the IUCN assessment that you can see here on the screen, that is that was done for Mola, Masturus, Lanceolatus, and Ransenia laevis. And some of the actual assessments are about 10 years old or more now. And so we wanted to revisit and see if any more information in terms of fisheries impacts had surfaced since. And I guess one of the aspects here is, we all focus very much on the global assessment of Mola that has been designated vulnerable. But a lot of the other assessments here are of least concern or data deficient or not assessed. And one of the things that also has happened is that we've had that revision in the taxonomy of Mola, and that kind of means that the whole assessment here has probably been done as a mix of 3 or 4 species even. And also, we now know that there has been a lot of confusion between the Molas and Masturus as well in terms of fisheries bycatch. So this is potentially confounded, making it interesting. But what I want to say here is that during this talk, when I say sunfish and molas, I mean all of these together, because we were not really able to separate them out in terms of interactions with fisheries. The IUCN assessment designated fisheries as the main potential threat to all of the molids, and it is also the main topic of this talk. So when we look at fisheries interactions with sunfish, one of the things that kind of stand out is that they're such atypical marine megafauna. So It's easy to classify them together with sharks and whales and turtles and all of those things, but the reality is that these guys have a different life history and are, as we have been speaking much about, they grow from these tiny little adorable spiky balls. Someone said to me, "Oh my God, that looks like a coronavirus." So not as good as looking like a sun, but they have this massive growth journey, a massive growth trajectory, and that sets them aside from a lot of other animals out there. And we face a few challenges in assessing fisheries impacts and interactions just because of this. They're also different because they've got very high fecundity. Exactly how high it is doesn't matter, but they don't invest a lot in one offspring. They invest a lot in a lot of offsprings, and the offsprings are tiny. In terms of Ransenia laevis, it is a very different kind of fish to the large species, and there is limited information in the literature in terms of fisheries and also other aspects of it. We have briefly discussed it in the chapter, but just because we're time limited here, I haven't really dealt with it in this talk, and I will refer to Martini's brilliant work that really is the best place to go for information on Ransenia in terms of fisheries interactions. Now, so the key question we were faced with in this chapter was to try and assess the scale of global fisheries interactions. And this is a big job because we're talking about fisheries everywhere on all the species. And the data is generally scarce and patchy. So it basically consists of discrete studies in the literature and then a lot of grey literature that's fisheries reports in many different languages, and then brief comments here and there. So from these sources, we tried to piece together all these little puzzles to see if there was an emerging picture. But one of the challenges is that it's quite hard to standardize all of this information so that we compare apples with apples. So the summary here that I'll just take you through briefly, because it's quite detailed in the chapter, but I'll just briefly take you through what we kind of found, and in terms of the commercial side of things, where sunfish are actually landed and utilized, and the other group where they're discarded or released alive, which is in this talk is when I say bycatch, I mean sunfish that were put back in the ocean, either dead or alive. So the commercial fisheries today in the world is basically Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, because this is where the commercial markets are. And the fisheries that catch these are two different types. One that's targeted, where people go out looking specifically for sunfish, and they use harpoons and set nets. The non-target variety is where the fishers fish for something else, and they just catch the sunfish and they bring them back because there's a market for them. And they're caught in quite a lot of different fisheries, longline, piscine, set nets, and also drift nets. The scale of it is hard to know. In Taiwan, they've got quite good records, with a top of about 1,000 ton in 2015. In Japan, the scale is basically unknown. A lot of the registration happens on a localized scale, and there doesn't seem to be a centralized agency that collates this information. In South Korea, the best estimates we could find were about some hundreds of individuals in 2010 to 2012. Now, all three species, Masturus lanceolatus, Mola, and Mola alexandrini, are utilized. We haven't yet seen Mola texai in any catch. There is also sporadic landings elsewhere in the world, but the markets are unknown, so there might be sporadic local markets here and there, but we really don't know very well. If we look at the FAO landing data for what they call ocean sunfish, which is best interpreted as all the large mullet species, we can see here that Taiwan has registered since 2003, and they have a top here in 2015. But Japan and South Korea are entirely missing here. So we know that the data is not complete. Another puzzling thing is that there are sporadic landings. For example, here in 2017, suddenly there was a lot of sunfish landed in the States. There's been some in Namibia, some in Argentina, a little bit in France, Ireland, Portugal. But as you can see, it's really not, it gives us some indication, but it's not a complete picture at all. In terms of artisanal fisheries, we know that there is that cool prehistoric fishery, St. Catalina Island in California. Today, it's very difficult to know exactly where sunfish are caught, but I know personally that they are caught in Indonesia. So these pictures are from La Malera, the traditional whale hunters up there that risk their lives to catch these, but they don't really prefer to catch them. They prefer whales and manta rays, but they will take them if there is nothing else. And they're also landed in a lot. I know in the Philippines they are also taken, but we know in Indonesia, even though we know that the Indonesians actually eat them, and we know this because when they crew on longliners in other parts of the world and sunfish are caught, the other crew will report that the Indonesians will eat these sunfish. So they are eaten, but they are rare at fish markets. So again, it's hard to say exactly what the scale is, both locally and globally, but it's certainly eaten, but probably the catches are not significant. So that brings us to the bycatch in the commercial fisheries. And now we're talking about sunfish that are caught and discarded. There are four main sectors that catch sunfish. Those are the driftnet, the longline, the trawl, and the purse seine sectors. Just quickly rehashing what this is. This is a trawler here. This is a boat that is just towing a whole heap of net, scooping up everything. This is a long line, and these can have hundreds of, or up to thousands or perhaps 2,000 hooks out in one go. And this is a drift net, and these can be kilometers long. A purse seine is where you sometimes have a spotter plane. You see something you want to catch and you surround it with a net and you scoop it up. So we trawled the literature to see what kind of information there was, because the IUCN assessment had been based on some really large numbers in, for example, the driftnet sector. And there are examples of these extreme catches that are really extreme, for example, the driftnet off California. But there are also numerous examples of fisheries where the catches are quite modest. But I guess in the driftnet sector worldwide, it is a worry that this kind of fishery has the potential to scoop up a whole lot of sunfish. The sector as a whole has, in some places there's been bans. We're seeing a decreasing effort, but there is still effort out there, and there's also illegal fishery to contend with. In terms of what happens once the sunfish are released, we know that they're, for example, in California, they're usually released alive, but it's noted that they have abrasions and physical injuries. So what the post-release survival is basically unknown. In terms of the long line, again, as far as we can tell, the CPUE, so the catch per unit effort, how many sunfish do you catch on a line, is generally modest throughout the sector, but the effort is enormous globally, so it all adds up to an enormous amount of interaction. So even if we don't know in every single fishery how many they catch, a good guess is that most longline fisheries will hook these guys. Now, the post-release survival again is unknown, but the sector usually release them alive by cutting the line that they're caught on, so they don't have to deal with them, basically. And so there is a good potential for them to survive, although we really don't know. The trawl sector worldwide is hugely heterogeneous. I can hardly say this word. There's so many different varieties of trawl. It can be small, large. You can trawl in the top water, mid-water, bottom, with all sorts of different gears, targeting different species of commercial fish. So the trawl fishery, we know, has the potential for high local catches, but it's very variable. And so that is a sector that is difficult to summarize. However, it looks as if the potential for mortality is quite high. So once they're caught in there, they kind of get squashed in there with a catch. They get hauled on board and potentially held in hoppers for a long time before the fishermen can get around to release them. The purse seine has very scarce, patchy information, but we know they are taken, including Ransania. Again, the post-release survival is unknown, and it probably depends on the fisher behavior. So we all know the dolphins that are released, well, if they don't release the sunfish and bring them on board, there is a potential there for some sort of impact. Then we get to the Mediterranean, and this makes me a little nervous because I've never been here myself watching this in action. So I've only heard from the various researchers who work there, including Natasha, who co-authored this paper. But there is a traditional trap net fishery there in the Mediterranean that dates back to the Middle Ages. So the extent proportion of this sector is small, but there are some fisheries in Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Morocco. And they have huge catches, as we have seen in some of the other talks, and it's mostly smaller, Mola. The catches were actually commercial prior to EU regulations. So sunfish were part of the Mediterranean diet, but it's now released alive, mostly. And so they look like they have a high survival. Natasha has done a little bit of tagging, and it looks like they do survive. But that, again, depends on how they're treated, because in some places this is how they're released, and while they may not die from getting a hook through, it will depend on what that hook penetrates. So this was Ed Polk's effort. So he was brave enough to actually do a summary map of all the fisheries, because it is just so hard to summarize. And we can see we do have some big fisheries that we know all around the world. Here are the commercial ones. Here are some big longline catches here in Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. But I guess from this map we can see that we know stuff, but there is so much we don't know. So it illustrates both what we know and also what we don't know. And we have seen that today with Martini's talk, where we can now add this sector here for bycatch of at least three different mullet species. So the data is scarce, but there are exceptions. The Californian driftnet fishery is an exception. The data is actually online. And you can see here that so this line here is the total effort, so the total number of nets that have been out since 1989. And you can see the effort has decreased steadily. The estimated total number of sunfish has fluctuated, but also decreased, but has been up around over 35,000 in a season. The catch per unit effort has gone up a little, and then it has crashed. So this is a very interesting data set, and it has also led to a really, really cool publication by Holbeck. But this fishery is phasing out in 2023, although I understand in federal waters, Trump vetoed the ban, so it probably will continue. But this fishery is notorious for bycatch of megafauna, including sunfish. So now with fisheries data, as Martini mentioned, and his work is a great example of it, there's probably a whole lot of data out there hidden away in offline databases in various fisheries departments that is in many ways a treasure trove for us sunfish researchers to get stuck into. But there are challenges associated with fisheries data, and one of them is that megafauna are notoriously unreliable in commercial logbooks. And with observer data, that may be reliable, but the cover can be patchy in a fishery. We also have the issue of species resolution that Martini also touched on, that we may not be able to get the fishery data even to genus level. As some of my work showed that in the Australian fishery, Masturus and the various Mola species were often mistaken for each other. We also have the problem in terms of assessing or using this data that maturity and sex are rarely collected, because you can't see the sex from the outside and you have to kill the sunfish to get that, and also the maturity stage. But one of the really cool challenges is the conundrum of how do you even, what's a sunfish and what is 1 ton of sunfish? Because most data is either in numbers or in total weight, and it's seldom both. And so if I told you I caught 1 sunfish, this is not the same. We're not comparing apples and apples, and we can subjectively understand this very well. And 1 ton of sunfish may be this one, or it may be a whole heap of this. Now, removing these from the system has very different consequences for probably the ecosystem, but also for the sunfish population. So this is a huge challenge in using and making sense of sunfish data. So the IUCN assessment nodded towards trends in fisheries data, where an increase in landing was seen as alarming. Likewise, a decrease in landings was alarming, and that is true, because if you see a decrease in landing, you may have a crashed stock. If you see an increase, you may have a crash in future. But using fisheries data and catch per unit effort as a proxy for population is powerful and is used very widely, but it has its pitfalls, and it has to do with assuming that the catchability of a taxa is consistent over time. But in actual fact, it is highly complex and variable, both time and space. And so, for example, as Laura Sousa was talking about, that sunfishes are patchily distributed. They're attracted perhaps to upwelling systems or fronts, and they have seasonality, they have migration. So if you have a fishery, I guess Martini's work shows this neatly, how a species can move in and out of a fishery. So depending on when and where you fish will influence your CPUE. And so one day you may see few sunfish, the next day you may see many. That's not necessarily because the population has increased in numbers. You may just have fished on it as it came through your fishing area. There is also something interesting here in terms of water column utilization by sunfish, because they do these foraging dives. And so if you are longlining, and you are longlining at the depth where they're feeding, they might take your hook. But if you're fishing at night when they're resting, you may not catch them. So your time of day and the depth that you are fishing and the gear that you're utilizing, all of these things held together with the diurnal behavior of the sunfish will influence the catchability of the sunfish at that time. So we did a little case study here. I'll go through it really brief. We looked at some bycatch data from the Spanish longline fishery in the Western Mediterranean here. So this is the Strait of Gibraltar and the Iberian Peninsula. And this is mainly Mola bycatch, which we confirmed with genetic analysis and some photos. And basically what you see here is average over time, and the bigger the little green blob, the more sunfish were caught. And you can see straight up here that they're caught, in a wide area, but there's something really neat going on here in the Tortosa Canyon. And so we looked at the data in different ways, and regardless of how we sliced it, we found that there was an effect of area. So you caught more in here. There was a seasonal effect. You would catch more during spring in this area, and it depended on what depth the fishing occurred at, and it even depended on the target species. We heard before that things like hook type can have an impact, and there has been other studies in Australia showing the same, that when you change from J hook to circle hook, the CPUE of sunfish changes and so forth. Bait might have an impact. And so really when you, and I wanted to mention in terms of landing data, that is also very difficult, because you are dealing with all of the complexity of the fishery itself, but then you have the added complexity of, is there a market for the sunfish or not? And if there is, the fishers might land the sunfish. If there isn't, they may not. And it also depends on what else they caught. If the boat is full of a valuable fish and there is a commercial market for sunfish, but it doesn't fetch as much money, they will discard it to have room for this other fish. So what's landed is hugely complex as well. So really, when we want to use CPU and landing data as a proxy for abundance to look for trends, do we have more sunfish or less sunfish? We really need to look very carefully at the heterogeneity of the fishery and the changes over time. Like Martini mentioned, there's a change in regulation, and that basically changes the CPU of sunfish and also the market dynamics. So it is complex to look at fisheries data and then say, are we catching less? Are we catching more? Are we catching and are we interacting with an acceptable number of sunfish? It's really difficult to say. An alternative approach is to gauge the resilience. And this is also called like fuzzy logic, or you kind of look at the life trait of your animal, and there is this gradient of being an R-selected or a K-selected type of animal. And down here we have fast growers that reach maturity early and pump out a lot of the highly fecund, and their life cycle is quick. Up in the other end, we have typical megafauna, marine megafauna, like they grow slow, they reach enormous sizes, they mature late, they have low reproductive output. So in terms of sunfish, they're really hard to place on this scale here. So they're certainly not K-selected in that in terms of reproduction. So they're more down here, but we really lack some information on growth rates and age at maturity to place them on this line here. And also, what's the importance of huge individuals? Is that important for the population to have these huge individuals, or is it enough to just kind of reach maturity and spawn once or twice, and that's enough to keep the population going? That's something we don't really understand at this point. Oh, yeah, and here it is, my little illustration of this. So is it enough to do a loop like this, or is it important for the population to have these massive individuals in it to produce reproductive output? And then it's, of course, important, once you have kind of placed your animal on this scale here, you need to know whether they overlap with fisheries. And that's hard, because we've just heard during this talk how we're starting to get a good handle of where the different species are, but exactly their range is still not fully understood. And also, where are the important part of the ranges? Just because you find a sunfish up here, it may not be an important part of its range. So species distribution models that Natasha Phillips is a champion in, and she did this brilliant piece of work here where she applied it to Mola as a genus. That is really useful for data for taxa. But to get it to species level for sunfish at the moment, we need species level data. And there isn't a lot of funding for this species, as we have all talked about. So it is really about doing opportunistic sampling, trying to tag onto other surveys that are targeting more kind of funded taxa, utilizing citizen science, and perhaps developing some standardized protocols that we can all work to, so that we can get more species-specific data to put into these models. We also need data from these areas where we don't have a lot of cover. And again, Martini's work was brilliant because it's offshore, and before that paper came out, we knew that there was some sort of interaction with the fishery there, but really we didn't know very much at all. And then and now we know. So it's important to ferret out information from wherever we can, and again, piggyback on other surveys that go out there. And then we need to understand depth utilization better for all the different species. A lot of the telemetry has been done on Mola and some on Mola alexandrini, but we really need to understand better how they utilize the water columns, and also there might be such a huge variation between areas that we may need to do a lot of tagging. So yeah, but anyway, so this is something that some information that's needed for us to get these species distribution models down to species level, and that'll in essence give us available habitat. And that, of course, brings us to climate change and potential range shifts. Because it is easy to sort of look at sunfish as that they have a massive thermal tolerance. But the species, each species has presumably a narrower thermal envelope where they thrive. And they do have a thermal budget that they need to work towards. So it's not like they can survive in any of these temperatures and thrive. They do need to be able to warm up at the correct temperature. And so, and again, where they hunt or where they forage and how cold it is there, it all needs to add up for them. So they can't just be everywhere, presumably. So it is highly likely that we will see range shifts, and perhaps that's what we heard from Northern Ireland. There was a range expansion. So it's not unlikely that there will be range shifts within this family. Then there is the issue of oxygen in terms of climate change, that we've seen low oxygen levels and shoaling. And that may contract the available habitats for sunfish. It's not entirely clear how long they can stay in oxygen poor waters, but they, I think it's from Tierney. I think Tierney did some work on this that shows that they can't stay there forever. So this may have some impact on them as well. So to sum this up, people always ask me, are sunfish endangered? And I never know what to say, because on one hand, they have a lot going for them. And I think some of the strongest defenses these fish have against anthropogenic impacts is that they're not very palatable, or at least not to the majority of the world. And they have low fillet yield to effort. So it takes a lot of work to get a meal out of them. And they're semi-solitary as adults, which makes it hard to scoop them up. And they do have a broad thermal tolerance, and they feed on abundant food sources. And they do have a high fecundity, so they at least have the potential to spawn out a whole heap of eggs. And they also have the potential for rapid growth. So they have a lot of good things going for them. However, there are so many things that we still do not understand that I feel is really important for us to get a handle on before we make a decision on the just exactly how vulnerable they are. And one of them is the growth rates. We really do need to understand how long it takes them to reach maturity, for example, and then after maturity, where their growth presumably slows off, how long does it take to reach huge size? And is that really important that the population holds these huge individuals? In terms of lifetime fecundity, how many years do they need to live to add to the spawning success? We also need to understand post-release mortality. I feel that is a really, really important thing for us to understand, because it's easy to say long lining, they're released alive, there's no problem there, but we really don't understand. And since the effort is so huge worldwide, it's a risky assumption just to make. And as well, you can, there's heaps of other unanswered things here on this list. But one of the other things that would be really neat is comprehensive landing data, because that will tell us what happens when you fish on a stock of sunfish. Do they, over time, do they get smaller and smaller and smaller when you fish them up? So you could make a surveillance of size classes over time of catches to monitor that. And again, another thing that I think would be so neat, if somebody would develop an assay for us to genetically or biochemically determine the sex, so we can get a handle on females, males, all of those sorts of things. And this will take international collaboration for sure. And so I want to thank you guys, Tierney, Graham, and John, for doing this project with us and making this book happen. And in particular, this symposium has been just amazing. I have just enjoyed so much seeing all of your faces and listening to all of these really interesting talks. So thank you so much to everyone out there. And that pretty much wraps this chapter up. And we can go to questions.
Okay. Wow. Great work, Marianne. Just great work. And we started this symposium saying how much we now know, but there are still some really basic things that we don't know. like males and females. What's going on with males and females? We have no idea. And so there's some real basic things that need to be, some gaps that need to be filled.
Yeah. And I especially, I mean, and I changed position on this, but I really feel that sunfish are quite unusual in that they have this massive growth spectrum. They're unusual in several ways, and so it's hard for us to place them within the, within these kind of types of organisms, that we have a better understanding of their resilience to, for example, fisheries interactions. And so when it comes to sunfishes, I just feel that we need to be a little bit cautious because, especially because we don't know the post-release mortality is a big thing.
Right. Yeah, no, it's definitely true. I mean, and I have mentioned, that maybe they're the fish of the future, but not without really doing our homework and knowing.
They may be the fish of the future.
Yeah.
But it would be very, very good to just do some checking.
Well, to fill in these gaps, we just don't know if they're endangered. And I think what I'm hoping, and what I would love as an upshot from this symposium, is to rewrite the IUCN red list, for us to really take a long, hard look at that.
Yes, and I think it would be very interesting because some of the data that was used for the Mola assessment were actually from the Masturus fishery, or fishery where we know now that Masturus is the main catch by one example. So there is some sort of confounded thing there between all these different species, and as we gain understanding of the different taxa in this family and how to tell them apart, it would be very interesting to revisit that assessment.
Yeah, I think it's high time that we do revisit it, because so many people look to that as their benchmark for policy action, and it puts them on people's radar, and we just need the best data available for those kinds of reports.
Yeah, because I guess for me it doesn't make full sense that Mola is listed as endangered while Masturus is listed as least concern,
right,
when we know there is so much species confusion in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Few quick thoughts. Really well balanced talk, first of all, because it's positive, but it is awkward. It's so difficult, it's so nuanced, these days. A quick thought, Michael Howard's comment on a bit of visual, low impact tagging could be quite cool. For example, you mentioned Camogli. Apologies to everyone who's Italian for my rubbish pronunciation. Sometimes you're getting 100, 200, the next day 300. I don't know if they're the same sunfish. So you could even do that very boldly, like with the basking sharks. They've done some visual tagging, which is even just like color coded by year, orange tags for 1 year, because no one's going to know all the ID numbers, but you could multi-layer that to get some info.
Well, excitingly, we are actually starting up tagging in, I think it's March or April. So Salvador Garcia Barcelona has he's spearheading a project there that they've got funded and they've hired people and they're ready to go. So they're going to just spaghetti tag all of these fish and look at recapture rates.
Yeah. It seems so obvious because it's so fundamental in salmonid research and everything else. Why not use a typical fisheries technique? That's one thing. The other thing, there was a lot turning attention back to something else to know a little about sea turtles, that with the Hawaii and places like that are so important for, pelagic understanding, and with some of the, they did a lot of mid-ocean tagging. That we are doing a lot of tagging, but we've got a bias in our sat tagging that we're tagging from the coast. And there's and so we're recording 8, 9, and we've learned a lot. but I think we're a little bit too confident in what we know. And there is that whole ocean business going on. Like leatherbacks spend, it's always amazed me. We always look at them with our bias on the coast because there's so many jellies at the coast. Leatherbacks spend about flipping 8 months of the year out in the open ocean, doing very, very well. There's a lot of gelata out there, siphonophores, pyrosomes, salps, all the weird and wonderful. So I think that would be something else to try and do, to tie in with bycatch, oceanic fisheries, and tag out there. Don't know what you think.
Oh, absolutely, for sure. And I think one of the frustrating things, though, is you know, if you know, we have to piggyback on other surveys, and it's just, you know, these sunfish are just not cooperating always. You know, so you can be at sea forever and there's no catch at all, and so to get a tag near when the action is, it's a real struggle.
It is, and
but through the fisheries observer programs, for example, here in New Zealand, they have MPI has quite a good longline program, and they can tag. So it is possible to equip fisheries observers with tags and get them in. And
tags are getting better. Because, you know, we've bought a couple of new generations of stat tags for basking sharks, a decent number. But because everyone's always with PSATs, they're great tags, they're beautiful tags, and they've been transformative. But the fact that the dive data stuff is so binned into these histograms, that everyone's done really good spatial analysis and looked at SST and everything, and then got to the depth and gone, because it's so awkward to interpret. We've written some weird algorithms to try and turn them into something better, and we've done a good job of it. But these new generation tags give us point data. So we will be able to reconstruct actual dive profiles, temperature, depth, and add that third dimension which is my midlife crisis, about adding that third dimension to the species distribution models. Nick Payne at Trinity is worth looking up. He does a lot of work on biomechanics and metabolism and physiology, and using accelerometers to really look at how biomechanical performance shifts with temperature. And so his distribution stuff is really cool because it's not absolutes, which sometimes they have, which is like you put a temperature on a map and you go, beyond this lies death, and just inside of it is good, you know, and that's not real. You know, so he can add some kind of physiological buffer zones to our species distribution models. We need more accelerometer data on that biomechanics. And so we've got the mechanism to underpin species distribution models. Otherwise, it's just descriptive.
Exactly. So plenty still to do, which is you know, it's a good thing as well.
Yes, no shortage of questions to be answered. I do remember there was some spaghetti tag work that was done in the Mediterranean, and nothing was coming back in the net. I'll have to. It was something Lucas told me about. But
Tierney, why didn't you tell me this when we were writing the chapter?
No, because I'm not sure it was ever written up. I don't know. It may be late, and I'm just misremembering it.
Right. Well, but that would be really interesting because they are going to revisit this in Spain, and so there will be some work coming out of there.
Well, I mean, it was my memory is that it was at a small scale.
Yeah.
And underfunded, and so I think that kind of tagging, you've just got to tag every single one, hundreds of them, and for over a long period of time.
Yeah.
Any sure. Yeah. So
yes. No, I do believe that they are going to do that. So I think there will come more information coming out. Salvador and I were talking about presenting the work, but we just ran out of oomph and time. So but at some stage, information will start to come out.
And then we'll have to get it ready for volume 2.
Yeah.
Virtual Symposium number 2 as well.
Yes.
But I'd also say, don't forget to pat yourself on the back for that work. You know, everything that's going on, because like they say in Ireland, there's been enough money spent on salmon in Ireland for every salmon to retire to Bermuda, you know, and it's true. Every country has 38 salmon biologists, you know, but there's still huge salmon projects going on, asking broad questions like, what do they do out in the open sea? You know, and that's 10 orders of magnitude more resources than we're playing with. This is kind of like science, anthropology, archaeology, trying to patch, you know, weird bits together. So I think you're very rational in how you're approaching it. It's very cautious, but it is building momentum. And I think you should, you know, you've done well. I think it's cool. But the fact that we got a long way to go is, it's challenging, but it's also phenomenal flipping opportunity to really make a difference to a species. And that's nice in a way.
That's important work. Yeah.
So I just want to say something in Te Reo Maori. I think it's called Iwaka Ekinoa. It means we're all paddling in the same canoe in the same direction. So this is what we need to do with the Sunfish group.
Yes.
Yeah, not turn it into a canoe race, which canoe races is not what we need. It's you know, and I like this gang of folk because, you know, I work on everything from flipping siphonophores to, but God knows how many types of megafauna, and it can get silverbacky, you know, and I think that's really boring. And I can remember standing up years ago in, where was it? Somewhere in Texas, a sea turtle symposium, and the guy stood up and said, what do you think the biggest threat to sea turtles is in the world? And everyone went, I don't know, bycatch, lost of nesting beaches. And he was like, because you're infighting, you know, and all this kind of stuff.
Egotistical researchers not sharing data.
Not sharing and competing and arbitrary and wanting to be the one who saves the species. And I think there's something nice going on at the minute. I think I need it.
Yeah.
Because I do a lot of silverbacky stuff, and I think it's a really
for those who don't speaking for our non-English speakers, silverbacking is gorillas are like the alpha gorillas that
is alpha males dominating kind of silos and bubbles and bouncing off each other rather than, as I said, paddling the same canoe.
Yes, I love that, the Maori.
No, they've got some good ones.
Good ones. All right. Well, thank you so much, Marianne. I hope you've got it in you to hang in there for a happy hour, at least for a little bit.
Oh, for sure. I haven't sat through this whole thing since 4 a.m. for nothing. And before we finish off, I just want to, I don't think I thanked my co-authors of this chapter. So guys, it was really fun, and thank you so much for your input. And and thank you guys again.
Wow.
It has just been such I think sunfish research will be before and after the symposium.
Yes, before the Common Era, then after Sunfish BCE.